We're turning our attention back to a humbling weekend for Irish rugby. I'm delighted to say Matt Williams is with us to give us some thoughts on it. Matt, good morning to you. How are you?
Good morning, Joe. Very good, mate.
So, a couple of things that we wanted to talk about. There's the macro picture of Ireland teams against English teams, and then there's the micro picture of Leinster not being able to get their way out of trouble that they caused for themselves against a team who they're very familiar with because they suffered the exact same fate just 16 months ago, 14 months ago, whatever it was now, this time last year. What's your overarching thoughts on what happened?
Well, I think we've got to remember the Saracens are a very good side. Like I think they're the best side in Europe. I know they're relegated. I know they've done some things wrong. When they beat Leinster last year, they were the best side in Europe. And I always thought this would be an incredibly difficult game for Leinster, even before COVID. And then when COVID hit, and you saw the draw, Leinster had a quarterfinal, semi-final and final to contend with, while Saracens have one thing in their mind. That's to prove to the rest of the world that they're right and everyone's wrong. They're going to go to second division in England, but they're still the best team. And they're on a bit of a mission, and they're going to be hard to throw. The other part was Leinster have done 25 games straight, and before the final last week against Ulster, I kept thinking, well, is this the game they played bad? Is this the game they don't do it well? And they didn't. They played pretty well against Ulster, but they didn't play well against Saracens. We have to say that. Saracens forced some of it, but some of it wasn't forced. Some of it was just errors from Leinster. They invited Saracens into the game, gave them such a strong lead that it was always going to be hard to throw them off. So, you know, Leinster were brave coming back, but I think we've got to keep it a little bit in perspective about how good a team Saracens are. And you looked at the team that ran out. You know, I know Owen Farrell wasn't there, but that forward pack was pretty immense. They exploited some poor refereeing at scrum time, and they got away with it, which I'll come back to later on because it's not what the game's about. But I don't think it's a disaster. And Leo, after the game, wasn't acting as if it was a disaster. It was hugely disappointing for everyone involved, but they were the better side on the day for sure.
What do you do when you keep getting out-muscled? Like, I think the reason that it's freaking out so many Irish rugby fans is that we've seen it against England in 2019, we saw it against England in 2020, we saw it against Saracens in 2019, we've seen it against Saracens in 2020, and this is supposed to be our best and brightest. They're the best coach team, they've got the most resources, they've got the biggest playing pool, and still, knowing what the challenge is going to be, they can't overcome it.
England are pretty good. That's hard to say. They're really doing things exceptionally smart at the top end of English rugby, not all of English rugby. The English national team has completely outthought Ireland in the last two Six Nations championships. They have been outstanding in the way they've picked Ireland apart from the first day at the Aviva 2 years ago to Twickenham last year. They literally picked Ireland apart at the seams through great thinking, fantastic play, and almost errorless play. And you have to say that Saracens have pretty much done the same. Now, let's again keep this in perspective. In the final last year that Leinster lost to Saracens, they should have won that game. There were two errors, and here's a word that would come back to, errors. Just before half-time, Luke McGrath didn't put the ball out. He should have kicked it completely into the grandstand. They get off. Leinster are well in front. And then Gary Ringrose had a 3-on-1 in the first 3 or 4 minutes of the second half and didn't pass. If they had a pass, they would have scored that try. It would be very hard. It would have been the exact same situation for Saracens with Leinster 20. I think it was a 17-point lead from memory. Don't quote me on that, but it was a significant lead if they had have done that. They didn't. Leinster have made errors, unlike Ireland. So let's put the Irish team here, the Leinster team over here. At the kickoff last week, Dev Tainer dropped the ball off the kickoff, knocked it backwards into another player and knocked it on. I can't remember the last time I saw Dev Tainer do that. How many forward passes, how many times were Leinster beaten at the breakdown? That they were really invited Saracens into the game. Again, the scrummaging was bad. Let's not get onto that now. So Leinster are making errors against Saracens. It's true Saracens are forcing them into it. But Leinster aren't a million miles away. They're not getting hockeyed off the park. They got beaten. There were some things that were wrong, but they're not far off. Where the Irish national team, that's a different kettle of fish. They're picked apart. They're a million miles off it. So I don't think to all the supporters out there, we should just say we're all in this same boat. The club rugby is a lot closer than the national rugby, in my opinion, and not all's lost. And I think I think last week's situation for Leinster was particularly difficult. I know it was at home. I know it was COVID, but they had great opponents who had nothing to focus on but that game for 7 or 8 months. Leinster have been playing on 2 fronts, and it just caught up with them. But I think the national stuff is very different. When we come out and see Ireland play against France in the next month, I know they've got Italy first, but let's just assume that they should do their business against Italy easy. Against France, this will be a very, very telling time for the national side and how their tactics will evolve and change, and they must. If they don't, when they come up against England again, they'll get belted again, because they just do, the way that the national team's playing, it does not have the resources and the thinking to overcome the English. The Leinster do, but Leinster have to cut the errors out of their game that they showed last week.
Are those errors, some of them were forced by Saracens, but the ones from the kickoff, Johnny Sexton kicking the ball out from the kickoff, they're not forced,
yep.
right?
No. No.
Is that, the word spooked was used in the aftermath by Leo Cullen. Is part of that, like, it has to be psychological. So what's causing that?
Well, I think there's a number of issues. They know that they're the one team in Europe, and I believe the one team in Europe that can beat Leinster. Whoever won that game for mine was going to win the tournament. And I think Saracens will have a challenge against Racing, but they are significantly in front of the rest. Racing at home are a difficult team, but I think Saracens will account for them, and I think they'll go all the way and win it. So the Leinster do know that when they front up against Mark McCall's team, there's a team that know how to beat them, and that's very unusual for Leinster, because Leinster have 25 games straight. I don't think that's ever going to be beaten in Irish club rugby. Or if it does, it's going to be an unbelievably good team. But I don't believe that's going to be beaten for many, many years. They were due for a loss. But, things like the Leinster maul was going forward, and they allowed Toje to get his hand on the ball, and the maul collapsed. It's a turnover 5 metres out. At times there in the first half where they probably had Saracens measure, and there was a bad pass. James Lowe runs into touch, like off a scrum, off tackle 1, runs into touch. I mean, they're things you yell at, you would yell at a 16-year-old and say, mate, never run into touch, tackle 1 in a scrum, just be patient, come back infield. Now that list, I could list off maybe 10 or 15 things. I'm sure Leo could list off 20 that Leinster just made errors. Is it spooked? Well, they're a great, Leinster aren't a bunch of children. They're a highly experienced side that have won European Cups and won, obviously, their domestic competition on multiple occasions. But Saracens are a team that are negative, and they play negative really well. And I think it is something the legislators of the game have to look at this and look at the negativity of how Saracens play. Their illegal scrummaging, and I will use that term illegal, the constant box kicking, and the way that they are slowing down and using the breakdown to within an nth degree of the law. And I thought the French referee let them get away with murder at scrum time. If you look at the scrums, if just everyone at home, if you get a chance, look at the scrums. Watch the Saracens loose head. The scrums like that, you're supposed to be loose head, hooker, tight head. The Saracens loose heads like that, which is causing the Leinster scrum to spin. And Leo hinted on it after the match. You can't come out and say what I say. But Saracens were just doing that all the game. There is nothing wrong. There's nothing in the law books that says your scrum can't go backwards. And why are we penalising teams when their scrum goes backwards? The scrum's allowed to go backwards. The scrums were supposed to be a contest. They weren't a contest for the ball. They weren't supposed to determine the outcome of games through penalties. And this is a huge issue in our game where our legislators, once again, are a long way behind the game. And they have to do something about this, because that game really was won and lost on scrum penalties. Leinster came back, did a really good job, but the number of points that Saracens accumulated on scrum penalties and position they got from scrum penalties turned the game. Scrums were never meant to be like that. And not only that, if we're going to stick to the laws, which I don't agree with, Saracens were doing much of the illegalities, and they weren't picked up on it. You compare that to Ulster's game against Toulouse, where referee Barnes had the game, and the scrums were a completely different kettle of fish. The ball was liberated from the scrums, both backlines attacked from scrums, and the penalties were much, much less. And Barnes was having none of that shenanigans, and he refereed it well. And I think if Barnes had a refereed the Leinster game, it may well have been a different outcome, because Saracens wouldn't have got the leeway at the scrum that they did.
Should Irish teams not be joining the likes of Saracens in this, I guess, moving of the gap between those who are trying to bend the rules and the legislators?
Tough question, mate. The older I get, the more I think I've got to stand up for the game. Leo and Mark McCall, their job's to win that particular match, and they do it. That's a coach's job. You know, you sit there and you say, well, when you're a coach, you sit there and say, I don't care if it's not spectacular. I don't care what people think. I just got to win. And that's the nature of the business. But when we're out here, well, I'm talking to you and I'm talking to all the people in Ireland that listen to your show, I certainly hope Ireland don't go down that path. Because, look, the English in sport, you know, I'm not being racist here, but they play negatively in most of their sports most of the time. They're not playing their sports in a really creative manner. Now, their cricket team has changed in the last 18 months, and their cricket team's playing some really attractive cricket, which is they haven't done for 120 years. You know, as Ian Chappell said, the only good thing that did for cricket or rugby was invented. Now, Eddie Jones has got that English national team playing slightly differently. I don't think, and it's not in the Irish, it's not in our nature to play that way. Irish teams, when they play well, play with creativity and they play with an expression of the national character. And Leinster has done that. So I don't think we should throw all that away on one performance. You're not going to win 26, 27, 28, 29 games in a season. You're going to have a bad day. And Leinster had a bad day. So again, we've got to keep it in proportion. But I do think we have to put pressure on the legislators of the game, those people whose job it is to look after the good of the game in the constant yin and yang between offence and defence, between the good and the bad, the negative and the positive, to keep it in balance. And right now, in many aspects of rugby, it is out of balance. It is much, much more in favour of the negative, of the destructive, than the creative and the positive. And we saw that on Saturday.
Look, it's hard to be on the other side of that, and to be on the other side of that so often over the years, where, you know, you think back to Neil Back's hand against Munster, and that's part of that culture that we don't have enough of or have any of, or like what's an acceptable level of gamesmanship from Ireland where you're like, yeah, okay, I understand what you're doing there?
Well, it's hard to say. Like, I've got great respect for Neil Back. He was a wonderful player. I coached against him for many years. He is sensational. His reputation will be forever tarnished by what he did that day. And I would have money. I've never asked him this question. I think if he had his time over again, he would definitely not do that. And I've heard some of his former teammates say that to me, but Neil's never said it, so I can't put words in his mouth. I mean, how would we feel if someone went out and played like that? I mean, it's just not. It's not the way the game's meant to be played. So you don't drop down. It's like we're saying here, and okay, people are stealing off each other. You say to the kid, okay, well, it's okay to steal because he's stealing off me. It's not okay to steal. And especially in a game of rugby, the game of rugby is about teaching young people about doing the right thing, respecting authority, sticking to a plan, and respecting the game. Now, what Neil Back did, that was the opposite of that. What a terrible example that is to all the kids out there. We're really fortunate that our Irish rugby players are really great role models. Now, we lost the game on Saturday, but we didn't see them bashing each other or punching or doing anything wrong. We didn't see them carry on like pork chops afterwards. They showed great humility, congratulated each other. No one better than Leo Cullen at that. Johnny Sexton's a great competitor, but he went into it. I don't think we should go to the lowest common denominator. And I don't think we have to. And again, let's keep this in proportion. the negativity on the scrums. The scrums have always been negative. Props are cheats. They're all born cheats, every one of them. They just treated better than the others. And I thought it was very bad refereeing. So you're always going to get that. But we have to think of a way that where we don't invite English teams into the game, where they can just then box kick, turn you around, play negative rugby. And even then, Leinster almost got back in. But I very much argue against going to the dark side. Stay in the light. Keep fighting the good fight. It'll come. You're not going to win the European Cup every year. I know in Ireland I say this to people all the time. They go, oh, but we love winning it. I know. Everyone loves winning it, but you just can't. And some days you get beaten by a better team. Now, I didn't agree with Saracens' tactics, but they were the better team on the day because Leinster made too many unforced errors. And let me, my old dad used to always say, in big games, the teams that make the least mistakes win. Now, there's a lot of other things happen in big games, but it's not a bad rule of thumb. And Leinster made too many errors when they had the ball in hand and in defence. That first try by Goob, it was a great offload, but that's just a missed tackle off a set piece. You should never let in a try off set piece. So there's a whole lot of factors that went into that loss, not just the negative view of the way the game is being played at the top end of English rugby.
Saracens are a really good team. They do have somebody in Elliot Daly who can nail you from 60 odd metres, and they can actually beat you in loads of different ways. So the scrum penalties is just a very interesting issue. I mean, we probably did speak about it in the aftermath of the World Cup final. The game was a bit ruined by the fact that the scrums were so one-sided, and actually, like, it's not a great spectacle. You know, I'm not a neutral observer at the weekend. I'm born in Kildare. I've been a Leinster fan all my life, and so therefore watching that's very hard. But you know, as you come back, the pain begins to fade, and you're like, actually, this is not a great game to watch if that's how one team is going to just beat the other in the scrums. And maybe that's sour grapes. Maybe it is just sour grapes. But certainly, I think you're right that there needs to be a consideration, at least, of how these rules are allowing one team to win big games.
You and I are talking about that. 100% right. It wasn't a great game to watch. Now, if you go and watch a game I went out to, my first live rugby game in 6 months, I went out and watched the Waratahs play the Melbourne Rebels at the Sydney Cricket Ground. And mate, I wrote an article about it in the Irish Times. I think there was 86 stoppages in the game. Scrums were taking 3 minutes to get set. And then there were penalties. There were resets from it. What is occurring in the game is not good. There is not a lot of entertainment. Now, there were some great games over the weekend around the world. So I watched Canterbury against Waikato. And look, go and watch that. It was just sensational. You know what the way that game down in Canterbury for the Ranfurly Shield. It was brilliant. The final of Australian rugby between Queensland and the Brumbies was a great game of rugby. But in every single game, the scrums are a blight. Scrums were never meant to be like this. Now, if you go and dig up a few old fossils like me, Fergus Slattery and some of the guys playing back in the 80s, this happened in the 80s. And what happened, the laws came out and said there will be no penalties from scrums because scrums were determining outcomes of games. And referees were getting it wrong in the 70s and 80s. So instead of getting a long arm where you can kick 3 points, they gave you a bent arm. So you could only tap the ball and run with it. You couldn't kick it goal. So if there was something wrong in the scrum, it didn't cost you the game. And what happened was people started scoring tries from scrums. They started running the ball from scrums because they couldn't scrummage for the penalty. That has to come back. We have to speed up the engagement of scrums. Look, at the game I watched, I think there were 14 scrums. Now, 14 times 3 minutes. Now, not all of them were 3 minutes, but that's more than half the game. We're sitting around doing nothing, waiting for the scrums to get organised. I mean, it's a blight on our game, as are the interpretations from the referees about the breakdown. So many times Leinster had the ball, and there was no way Maro Toji, who's a wonderful player, by the way, I'm not complaining about him, he's a very smart player, wonderful player, possibly captain of the Lions. He could just he's got his giant arm through, put his hand on the ball. He had no intention of picking that ball up, but he had his hand on the ball. laws say you got your hand on the ball, you're entitled to it, it's a penalty within 2 seconds. You know, like, that's not what the game is meant to be. The game was meant to be a contest. That's not contesting the ball. That's getting your hand on the ball. So there's so many aspects where our legislators in World Rugby are miles behind and years behind. The World Cup final was a blight, as was the interpretation of the high tackle at the World Cup. Again, no one complained about the policy of the high tackle. No one, the high tackle should be gone. But they brought it out at the World Cup. I mean, how dumb is that? To do it at your greatest, where the most people around the world are watching your game, and you bring out an interpretation of the law that no one has ever seen. So the way out the laws are being conducted in rugby, the way the legislation is being put together, and the way it's being interpreted by our referees is without doubt the biggest issue in the game, and it has been for many years. And I'm not popular at World Rugby because I've been saying this for many years. When I coached Ulster, we had some disastrous refereeing because of interpretations of the breakdown. And the coaching is a mile in front. So Mark McCall outthought all the legislators and all the referees. So that has to catch up. It's like the internet. The internet's a mile ahead of the parliaments. The coaching and the implementation on the game is a mile ahead of rugby's parliament. And rugby's parliament has to catch up.
Matt, what you're saying is very interesting this morning. One other factor that perhaps maybe we haven't discussed enough over the last 2 years since that fairly humbling day against England at the start of 2019. Are English rugby, English clubs, and the players that they have, are they simply just much better than Irish players? Like when you talk about depth, when you talk about the once-in-a-generation players like Mara Itoje, as you mentioned there, are they simply just a far better player group? And with all the talent that they have, we actually have to overachieve to hope for parity consistently?
No. I mean, England's got more rugby players than any country in the world. They've got a phenomenal competition, but it is littered with foreigners. They have a lot more foreigners playing. And like one of my great mentors said to me once when we were at a conference, New Zealand were bragging at this conference that their top 3 teams could beat any of the top Australian side. The one on the top Australian side, they could pick 3 teams and their thirds would beat them. And Brian O'Shea, Box O'Shea, just gently looked at him and said, "Matty, the mongrels can only put 15 on the field at one time. Don't worry." Now, England have got great depth, but they can only put 15 out at one time. So they'll always have more depth than Ireland. They'll have more depth than Australia, more depth than just about anyone in the world. But Ireland has an exceptionally good system. And again, we've got to keep this in perspective. Ireland won a Grand Slam against a very good England side, coached by the same guy on St Patrick's Day 2018. Now, since then, England's tactics have been phenomenal and Ireland's have gone backwards. And we have to just call a spade a spade. And I've been saying this for some time, maybe very unpopular, and I don't know why, because I've been proved to be right. I'm not trying to shoot anyone or anything. I'm just telling the truth. From that day, from that high point and beating New Zealand, Ireland's play has been picked. It's been absolutely picked apart like a seamstress taking a shirt apart at the seams. And the world knows how to beat Ireland. And until Ireland's tactics grow and change, their formations change and they put some doubt in people's minds that they can't do it, England will continue to beat Ireland. But that's got nothing to do with their system being better or so on. They've got some great players at the moment, just as we had. You know, we had O'Driscoll and Paul O'Connell. They're generational players. We've still got some great players, and many of those players beat England 2 years ago for a Grand Slam at Twickenham. But England's tactics have just ripped Ireland apart. And I've got to say this, Ireland hasn't adapted, hasn't changed, hasn't moved forward. Leinster has. Leinster have been beaten by the best side in Europe twice. But so have Ireland at the national level. But Leinster haven't been picked apart. They've been beaten. But Ireland at Twickenham last year, mate, that was bad. Ireland at the Aviva the year before, that was bad. So there's a huge, huge challenge for the national team. There's still a big challenge for Leinster and Munster, of course, and the rest of Irish rugby. But Leinster are the second best team in Europe. I don't know that Ireland are the second best national team in Europe. They're certainly not the second best national team in the world. Leinster will go toe-to-toe with the Canterbury Crusaders or whoever you go in World Rugby. They'll go toe-to-toe with. But I don't think the national team, using the tactics we last saw, will do that. So the national team has a very, very long thinking process, planning process and change that it has to go through. And it is a big challenge, not a small challenge. It is a big challenge.
Are we being outthought?
Yes, 100%. Now you've got two regimes that went in. Joe was outthinking everyone, and then he you know, Joe Schmidt. Everyone thinks because I criticised Joe Schmidt at the end that I didn't respect him or didn't like him. The exact opposite. He was unbelievable with Leinster. He was incredible with the national side, what he achieved, and their performances against New Zealand. That culminating that night at the Aviva against New Zealand was just staggering. And I came out and said Ireland can win the World Cup. I said it in the paper. I said it on your show. I said it everywhere. I thought Ireland could win the World Cup after that. They were great, and they regressed. They got much more conservative, and they became predictable. Now, in rugby and coaching, if you can predict what your opposition is going to do, you can stop it. And that's what occurred. Ireland started to get predictable. Now, poor old Farrell comes in, you know, he's only got a few games, but they hadn't evolved, they hadn't moved on. Now, it's a tough question to ask them to move on and change so much, but we didn't see a lot of change. They were playing the same sort of Joe Schmidt game. Now, Farrell was put in as a coach to continue on Joe's legacy. The problem was Joe's legacy at the end wasn't a good legacy. It obviously needed radical overhaul. And the way England changed, if you compare the way England changed from how they played on St Patrick's Day at Twickenham to the way they played against New Zealand in the World Cup semi-final, England's tactics and thoughts had changed radically. And again, England's tactics from the Aviva in the Six Nations when they beat Ireland to their tactics at Twickenham last year, again had evolved and changed, and definitely Ireland had been outthought across the park in almost every area. And that is worrying, and it's something that we're going to have to keep a close eye on over this autumn internationals and obviously the Six Nations coming up. Because we'll need to see progression, we need to see change and growth in the way the team plays.
Last question for you then, is the Pro 14 an issue? Is the quality of the Pro 14 an issue when the Irish teams go into Europe, or is that a little bit of a red herring at the moment?
Look, there's a yes and no to this. If we don't respect our own competition, no one else is. It's like self-esteem. If you don't respect yourself, no one else is going to respect you. So you've got to respect. We've got to stop talking the Pro 14 down. We've got to, and I know it's not at the same standard as top 14 in France and the English Premiership. However, I live in France most of the year, and I can tell you the top 14, a lot of those games aren't worth watching either. So, you know, I've just watched Rugby Australia, Super Rugby Australia, and there were a lot of games there that weren't worth watching either. So I don't think we're always very hard on ourselves, and I think we shouldn't be. I think we've got to cherish that competition, and we've got to improve it. We've got to think of ways where we put more on it. The problem is Ireland has this incredible love affair with the Heineken Cup, and so nothing, your year's a failure if you don't make the Heineken Cup final or win it. And I don't believe that's the case. It's like I said on your show a couple of weeks ago, you know, making a semi-final for Munster isn't a failure. You know, they haven't been greatly successful. We're still not a failure. There is lots of thinking to do with the Pro 14, but teams not putting their best teams out in enough matches, that is a problem. But because Irish teams don't put their best teams out in the rest of them, that's why they're doing so well in Europe. So you sort of got this dichotomy. Now, we also have to remember that we've got Ulster made the quarterfinals, Leinster made the quarterfinals, Leinster made the final last year, Munster made the semis last year. So Ireland are punching above their weight as far as their numbers in their country goes. They're still performing. This year hasn't been a great year. That's always going to be the case. I think not every year you're going to come home with the shield. Let me say, I think Irish rugby is in a very healthy state. I think the development of the age group teams, where we saw the 20s doing so well for the last few years, moving through, the provinces doing pretty well. They're not basket cases in any way. They're moving up. They're highly competitive. And the national team's thinking has to change for sure. But Irish rugby is still pretty healthy. It's not disastrous. And I don't think we should all lose heart from those results on the weekend. It's a bad weekend, but, you know, the boys will go away, wipe their noses, clean up the cuts, come out and be fighting again in a few weeks, and you know, Irish teams will play well, and I hope they play positive rugby and they stick with that mindset that has got them to where they are, and they have to keep growing and changing. Don't give in to the dark side. You've been therapy for the very disappointed Leinster and, by extension, the Ireland rugby fans this morning. Matt, great to have you with us. Thanks a million. Lovely to talk to you both. Have a great day, guys. That's our resident Dr. Jennifer Melfi there, giving us some thoughts about what happened at the weekend.